a magnificent film. There is so much to talk about, ladies and gentlemen. The filmmaker, Walter Murch. That was a great screening.
It was. It was the screening I hoped we would have back in 1985.
Well, we got it today. Often with fantasy films or family films like this, it's often a gun for hire, or they hire a director onto a project, but this had deep roots with you.
Yes, yes it does.
And can you talk about when you were first exposed to the Legends of Oz?
Yeah. My mother was born in what is now Sri Lanka, Ceylon. She was the daughter of two medical missionaries there. And the big thing that was happening at that time in the world of kids were the Oz books. It was like Harry Potter today. Every year there would be a new book. And so she grew up in this tropical paradise on the equator, but her parents were Canadian. And so she was reading these books about an exotic place that is the land of Oz, knowing that someday she would leave Sri Lanka and go back to Canada, the United States. And so it was kind of a reverse reality for her. But anyway, it made a huge impression on her and her brothers and sisters. And so when I was growing up, those were the books that she read to me. And this film is based on two of the subsequent Oz books. And the Ozma of Oz book was the first book that I thought I would read by myself, a grown-up book, meaning more words than pictures. So I don't know, age 5 or 6 or 7, sometime in there. So deep impression. The imaginative world of L. Frank Baum, which you can tell, excuse me, is very strange, wonderful, formed a huge part of what my imaginative life is. And flash forward many decades, and Disney Studios is at they're wandering in the wilderness in a sense, because Walt had died in 1966, I believe, and there were a number of projects that he had set in motion, but none of them, once they had been done, people wandered around wondering, what would Walt do? Where were we? And a kind of crisis happened with when Disney saw the films Star Wars and The Black Stallion, which were the films, these are the films we should be making. And so they began to reach out beyond the Disney wall. Disney Studios at that time was well known as being a kind of self-contained monastery within Hollywood. And I was one of the fish that their net caught. I had been a co-writer on the early drafts of The Black Stallion, and George Lucas was a friend, and Francis Coppola, so they thought maybe some of the magic of those guys would rub off on me. And so it's just one of those Hollywood meetings. I found myself sitting on the other side of a desk from Tom Wilhite, who was a developmental executive, and he said, what would you like to do that you would think we would also like to do? And I had obviously given it some thought. And this was around a number of years after Sesame Street. And there was a sensibility in the Henson puppetry that I there's something Ozian about that, let alone the fact that Frank Oz is part of the Henson organization. So I thought maybe there would be a way to combine that technology and that sensibility with the subsequent books of The Wizard of Oz, the follow-on. And so that's what I said, a sequel to The Wizard of Oz. And he sort of jerked back in his seat and said, well, you know, we own the rights to all those books, which I didn't. I had no idea. And Disney himself had intended to make an Oz book film. And it actually, I think they made some TV experiments in that direction. And for one reason or another, it wasn't followed up. So this relit a match that they had been trying when Walt was alive to, so it got some traction. And the next step is writer treatment. And so I had been collaborating with Gil Dennis on another screenplay, and so we switched tracks and set ourselves the goal of writing this treatment, which the immediate problem was that the first sequel after The Wizard of Oz was a book called The Land of Oz, but Dorothy was not in it. And there were some good characters. Jack Pumpkinhead is in it, and Dick Gump. And at the time, this is back 120 years ago, the fans of those books, all the kids, said, okay, you wrote a sequel, but where's Dorothy? And so he knuckled down and wrote Ozma of Oz, where Dorothy shows up, and that's where TikTok emerges out of that, and Belina. So we shuffled those two books together and produced a treatment, and which got another green light, and we wrote a screenplay, and one thing led to another.
The first 20 minutes, the opening, that was not from the books.
That was not from the books, although there is a storm in in each of the books. There's a premise of how do you get to Oz. A tornado in The Wizard of Oz. There was a storm at sea in this one, and Dorothy was traveling with Uncle Henry to visit some relatives in Australia, and I thought, well, maybe not. There's the story behind this story was that my daughter Carrie was about to leave home, 18, and so my wife and I were buying some furniture for her to get her going. And I was at an antique store in San Anselmo, which is a town just north of San Francisco, kind of a used consignment place. And there's the chest of drawers, and over in the corner there was a weird pulsing kind of a thing that sort of metaphysical pulsing. And I thought, what's over in that corner? And went over and was suddenly looking at the machine that you see Dr. Worley operating, literally that machine. And I went to the guy behind the desk and I said, what is that thing? And he said, well, it's a prototype of an electrotherapy machine, not an electroshock, an electrotherapy machine that were very popular around the turn of the century. And this was invented by this guy's grandfather, and this guy had just died, and this is on consignment. I said, how much is it? $125. Didn't have that at the moment, so I said, I'll put a deposit down it. And one thing, I was not making the connection with this story at all. We hadn't begun to develop the story yet. And time went by, and a friend of my wife was in that store and saw this machine with the name Murch on it and thought, is that the guy? And yes, and so he told my wife, and my wife, Aggie, went and paid $25 every week or so and gave it to me for my birthday. And it was similar to the kind of objects that my dad, who was an artist, would paint. That was the connection I was making. And so I, very happy to see it, and I put it, screwed it onto the wall, and I was sitting there chewing pencils thinking, how can we begin this story? And I suddenly saw the face in the machine looking at me, and I suddenly went, and began research and discovered that, yes, at that time, there was a big surge of interest in electrotherapy. And it was all over the United States at the time. Anyway, that cinched the deal.
I felt it, it's so real and so grounded and scary, so that when you go to Oz, there's really a transition. But I was curious, how did the producers in Disney feel about the opening 20 when the script?
It made some of them nervous, but not enough that they said, don't do it. You got little quaverings of their voices about the beginning, and I said, no, this is what I'm doing. And I think they were, I'm reading into their minds, which is not what you can do, but they were really casting for new ways of doing things. And, if you had pitched Star Wars to them, they probably would have had questions about that in advance. So, okay, let's see what happens. So it got the go-ahead, the treatment, and then the screenplay, and we were off and running.
What were the next steps from that? Was it the building, casting?
The usual stuff, the development. Norman Reynolds, who had been the production designer on Return to Oz, Gary Kurtz. I asked George Lucas, it looks like this is a go. Who do you think can produce this? And he said Gary. Gary had just produced another Henson film, Dark Crystal. And so those things were in place, and so we decided to shoot in England because of that, because Henson was based in England, and Norman Reynolds, obviously, and we went on location. The original plan was for a kind of Raiders of the Lost Ark scope to it. We were actually going to go to the Sahara Desert, with the Deadly Desert, and all kinds of exotic stuff. We looked at ruins in Rome, Hadrian's villa. We were going for it. Sardinia, and the budget kept going up and up and up. And suddenly there was a change of management at Disney, and Tom Wilhite and Mr. Miller were gone, and a new regime came in. And they looked at this, they looked at the budget, they looked at, there were no big roles for stars in it, and they said, this is not something that we want to do. And so it was put into turnaround, which was one of those crises that we confront often. I went and talked to Richard Berger, who was the head of Disney at the time, who had come down with that. And I said, can we talk about what the real problem is here? And he said, it's the amount of money, that going on location with this kind of thing, with your limited experience in that area, it can rewrite the screenplay and reduce the budget by whatever it was, $7 million, $7 real million. Don't just print the screenplay in smaller type. And so I buckled down in, I forgot, I think it was November of '83, and I cut out a whole bunch of people. There was a role for a number of soldiers of the army. TikTok was the boss, but there would be, people who would salute him, and that and a number of other things did, in fact, cut it down. I had no idea, as I was rewriting it, I was just, I was letting my hands do the work, in a sense. And I handed the manuscript in, not knowing how long it was, and my secretary at the time retyped it, and it came out at 108 pages, and I thought, I did it, that is, it's going to get under the limbo bar here, and in fact it did, and then it got, the green light went back on again. Although I lost Gary Kurtz, or rather he was, how do I put this? Richard Berger came into the office and he was grinding his teeth at Gary's lack of attention to the budget, and said, I'm just going to have to let him go, I'm going to have to let him go. I said, well, I understand, I want to make the film. And he went down the hall, and I waited 15 minutes, and he came back with his arm around Gary, and he said, it's all going to be okay. Gary was promoted to executive, which means that he wouldn't have any of his hands on, and I was reassigned Paul Maslansky, who was, he died a few years ago. I had met him on The Right Stuff when I was going to be editing The Right Stuff, and he was assigned by the Ladd Company to mind the budget of that film. So he was absolutely the opposite of Gary, very hands-on and tough and cracking the whip. And I kind of appreciated that because Gary had not been that. And yet, he was working for the studio rather than being the producer of the film. And we had him over for dinner, and we had a great time. He's a jazz musician, plays the trumpet. We had a lot of common experience in Greenwich Village in the 50s. And at the end, as he was saying goodbye, he said, I can't be your friend on this film. I may have to do things, so I'm not going to let friendship get in the way. And that was sort of ominous, but I knew what that meant. And we started shooting in February of '84. And things were good, but slow, because you can tell it's a complicated film. And we were shooting the Kansas material. That's what we began with.
Where was that? It wasn't Kansas. It was. Where was that? If it wasn't Kansas, it was out by.
Yes. It's a whole other little thing. You have Berger. It's coming back to me. He said, "You'll get a green light if you can find Kansas in England." And I thought, okay. And we had been looking, but this is pre-digital, so it's not like you can erase power lines or anything, And Kansas is not in. We couldn't find Kansas in England up to that point, and then it finally came down to a suggestion from Norman Reynolds that we look, rather than going north, we would go west, down near Salisbury. And we looked at one place and I wasn't going to do it. And the time came, he he said, I'm going to leave at 10 o'clock, give me a phone call if you found Kansas. So at 9:30, we pulled over to the side of the road. It was a pub with a phone booth, and I phoned the number, and I said, we found it. It's going to be fantastic. It's just like Kansas. I feel like I'm in Kansas now. It's a lie. But I managed, it's that George Burns, the key to acting is sincerity. If you can fake that, you got it made. And I got back in the car thinking, what have I done? And I told Norman, he said, that's the spirit. Because he's been there many times. Anyway, we essentially rounded the corner, and I found myself on the training ground for munitions for the British Army in Wiltshire, which is maybe a circle of land 60 miles in diameter, where they blow things up. And they've been doing that for 150 years. The Crimean War, the first, it was where their testing ground. But that meant that there were no buildings on it. It was just the Wiltshire Plain, and there we are. The plains of Kansas. Here was geologically the same thing, but because of the Army's effects, there were no buildings on it. And so I was suddenly looking at Kansas, and that's where we built the house, and this was a huge big learning experience, but we had been looking for flat land because Kansas is flat, but what's flat in reality and what's flat on the screen are two different things. And in fact, this area had a kind of rolling flatness to it. But what that meant was that the horizon, which in this film looks very far away, was actually just a roll of the hill, maybe half a mile away. And that made the horizon very clean. Whereas a real flat horizon kind of disappears in mist, and you see all kinds of power lines and other things. So it's the lesson of film is illusion. You do what you can. Anyway, that was a powerful moment in the film.
And you set forth shooting with Freddie Francis at first, right?
Yeah, Freddie Francis, who I greatly admired, and our gears did not quite mesh. He was he said, show me the shot and I will light it. And that sounds obvious, but it's less obvious. So I would say, okay, it's this shot, and we're going to use a 40mm lens, and the actors are 4 feet away, And then he would bring in the lights. But what that meant was that he was lighting for this specific shot, which meant I couldn't use a B camera, a second camera, except in a very narrow way to use a telephoto lens along the same axis as the first one. And this film ultimately required multiple cameras to finish it in time. And so the gears of the filmmaking were slower. And my inexperience, the first film I directed, and it's a complicated one because it has a 9-year-old, literally 9-year-old star who can only work 3.5 hours a day. So we had to use doubles to fill in. And for much of the film, she's the only living creature on screen. Everyone else is either not there at all, meaning the claymation, or it's puppetry, and that creates its own, how do you hide the puppets who are working right off screen? So it was heavily storyboarded by Mike Plug, wonderful storyboard artist. Yes, good for Mike. Absolutely. And anyway, we did not go fast enough, and Kansas is, it's kind of Ingmar Bergman in Kansas. It's serious stuff there. And that didn't make Disney very happy. The slowness of the shooting and the Kansas material. And things came to a head finally, and Freddie Francis quit. I think the thing that finally tripped him up, he had been, the last film he did was the David Lynch Dune film, which was a huge, monster, complicated film. And I think he thought, oh, I'll be back in England, it'll be shooting at Elstree, it'll be nice and simple, and it clearly was not. Anyway, the throne room that you see here is literally a mirrored room. The ceiling is mirrored, the floor is reflected, the walls are mirrors. And the kind of photography that he does, which involves multiple lights close in by the camera, it just wasn't going to work. And so he came up with a solution which was just, in retrospect, not the answer to it. He put the lights coming in from the ceiling, which made everyone have dark shadows on their faces. I mean, we just saw some tests, and they were, I was very unhappy with them. And I think that was the trigger that he said. So David Watkin came along. I'm a great admirer of his style of shooting.
Richard Lester films,
yes.
Ken Russell.
Yeah. And he said, we met, we got along, and he said, I work completely differently than Freddie. I won't even be on the set. I pre-light the set. I don't care how many cameras you use. You can use 6 cameras. They will all look great because of the way I like. And I will be on the next set, pre-lighting the next set. And if there's any problems, Gordon, the first A camera operator, will solve them for you. If there's a real problem, then I will reluctantly come and try to solve the problem. And so I took him into the throne room, thinking, how's he going to do this? And he looked at it, and he said, I've been waiting for this set my whole life. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put a 25K over in the corner. This is 25,000, a huge light. And I will bounce that light off the ceiling, and bounce it off the floor, and bounce it off the wall, and bounce it off the ceiling again until it finally lands on the actors. Each time it bounces, it spills 20% of its light, so that creates the fill. And by the time it reaches the person, it'll have this lovely shimmering, and you do it all with just one light. It's like he's playing pool, billiards with light, and that's in fact what he did. And for every set, that was how it worked out.
Like Rube Goldberg.
And he wound up shooting all of the Oz material. Freddie Francis shot all of the Kansas material. So, in a sense, switching cinematographers is our equivalent of the 1939 transition from black and white.
For the first film, it is so complicated. There's puppetry, and there's stunts, and there's claymation, and there's so much. But also for Fairuza Balk, such an amazing performance. How did you find her?
Well, she was the Dorothy that emerged after doing testing 1,200 Dorothys all over the United States and Canada. And we did casting sessions in all the major cities looking, and my goal was a Dorothy who was the same age as the Dorothy in the books, whereas Judy Garland in 1939 was 15, I think. But I wanted a girl who was really the age that Dorothy Dorothy was in the books. And that initial testing filtered down. We shot some videotape there, and I screened some of those. And then that got down to, I think, 60. And then there was an additional testing of those 60, which came down to 12. And then we did video tests at Disney Studios with those 12. And out of that emerged Dorothy and another girl who were possibilities. Both of them Canadian. You know, why that is, I don't know, but they were both Canadian. Because maybe my parents were, who knows what it was, but I liked their voices. There was no whiny element to them at all. And we then brought those two girls to London and shot tests in costume with the characters, which were already developing on the sets. Some of the sets had been built. And then finally decided on Ruza. And I was aware of being a child actor is one of the most dangerous professions in the world because, the expectations, what that does to a kid. And my hunch was that Ruza could survive it, because of something. In between takes in London, where is Ruza? Oh, and we'd hear laughter, and she had climbed up some of the sets and was, laughing at us from way up there. Come on, Ruza, come down. She got along well with the crew. There was just no. She'd never been in a film of this size. She shot some commercials in Vancouver. And so after making that decision, and Richard Berger approved of that decision, we were, Aggie, my wife, and I, and Catherine, Ruza's mother, and Ruza went out to dinner, and we just started talking. And, oh, well, we live in Canada, but we come from California, from the valley. But we've been in Canada for many, 5 or 6 years. But when we were in a little town in California when I was pregnant with Ruza, this is Catherine, and we wanted to go to a place that had natural childbirth for it. I was married to my husband at the time, was a musician. He was in the Renaissance Pleasure Fair kind of a thing. And Aggie and I started to get a little quirky because that was in our area. Well, where did you go? Oh, it was a little town, Point Reyes in California. And we suddenly went, because that's just 10 miles north of where we live in Bolinas. And they went to the same doctors who did natural childbirth, where Aggie worked as a nurse. They were doing midwifery. So Ruza was born a year after our daughter in the same clinic, the same medical service. And had it been different, Aggie would have been a midwife to Catherine delivering Ruza. So it's one of those coincidences that just, makes the hair stand on the back.
And then she, for her first role, she used to act with Nicole Williams in Excalibur. Can you talk about Nicole Williams?
Yeah. No, she's, it's fantastic looking at her. Just, the thinking that's going on there, and the technical and emotional wisdom of her. I would say she's an adult from the land of children, is what how I would say it. Down to things like we would do a reshoot a couple of weeks after a scene, but we needed a pickup shot, and I would say to her, "Oh, we're going to do this," and she would immediately go, "Oh yes," and she knew her eye lines, exactly the way they were 2 weeks earlier. it's a lot down. She was working with Mike Kitchens, who was her acting coach, and they had developed a language of jewelry and precious stones. Perusa means turquoise, and so they took that, and so for various emotions, they just had a shorthand of, this is a ruby emotion, this is an emerald emotion, this is gold, this is coal, you know. And so in a scene, I would just say turquoise or ruby or emerald, and you know, she would be in it.
You know what I was obsessed with as a kid, and still what I don't understand how it's done, is the wheelers. I still don't know how that's accomplished and what I'm looking at.
We just found guys with wheels.
Was that very complicated to shoot and set up?
Complicated is the word. It's all complicated, you know. It's TikTok is a whole other story. But the wheelers, we found that people who did yoga were good at being wheelers. They knew kind of the moves. They could sustain that tension. And you know, John Stevenson did the prosthetics for that, and basically it's just a thing that was bolted onto their arms, and they could control the wheels. The wheels had little brakes on them, the front wheels, and they practiced and practiced and practiced, and they got so good at it that in the end they didn't want to even take them off. So lunch breaks, they just kind of stand there and people would feed them, and they they're bikers basically, and so the sensibility of that got into them, except they're bikers who did yoga.
TikTok seems like the exact opposite, where you couldn't move, right? It's just waddled.
Yeah, it's Michael Sundin, who was the trampoline champion in England. It's another story, and he had a very low center of gravity himself, but he put his feet in the legs. His legs are in the legs, but then he's bent over with his head between his legs, facing backwards, looking at a closed circuit video screen, which is coming from a camera outside him. And he's also controlling the arms by crossing his own arms. So if he wants to move his left arm, he uses his right arm, he uses his left hand, but he's facing backwards, and there's no air in there. So there was a 2.5 minute thing with him. Okay, Michael, are you ready? Yes. So Plank, he gets put inside the sphere. The head is being controlled by Tim through radio control. So another person is controlling the eyes, the mustache, which stands for the mouth, and the rotation of the head. And the two of them work together to create this creature, which, you know, I mean, I'm completely gobsmacked also just because of the presence now of TikTok. What does TikTok mean today? And a lot of his lines in the movie are lines that could be said about artificial intelligence. You know, I'm not alive, but I never want to be. I value my lifelessness. And obviously AI, sometimes the thinking winds down. These hallucinations. And, you know, historically, that book was written in 1907, and that character is the first articulate robot in literature. There were other creatures, animatronic people in the 19th century, but in terms of a person that you interacted with intelligence, and you know, the separate keys for action, thinking, and speaking, that's the first time that hit the page.
As if 3.5 hours for an actor wasn't enough, you had a 2.5-minute actor that could only
Yes.
be in there.
Yeah.
Jack Pumpkinhead.
Right, Brian Henson, Jim Henson's son, was responsible partly for the design of Jack, and gave his voice.
The voice is so clean. It's one of my favorite voice performances.
Yeah.
And it's very different than Hoggle that he does in Labyrinth the next year, which is very guttural.
Right.
It's very. Did you work on voices with him, or do you come in with that?
In terms of the performance?
Yeah, in terms of finding that voice for him, what he was going to sound like, because he could look scary,
Yeah.
because the voice was so like beautiful.
Yeah.
You immediately, and childlike, you immediately fell in love with
Yeah,
that character.
no, it's just, as a director, yes, I worked with it, and the voices of TikTok and Alina and Jack Pumpkinhead and the Gump were all ADR. I mean, we roughed in the dialogue at the time of shooting, but, the final voices were done in the studio looking at the characters on screen.
And Belina, there's times where I'm like, is that a real chicken? Is that a puppet? I can never tell.
Right?
How was that done?
Well, it's, sometimes she's a puppet, sometimes she's a real chicken. It's, Mike Cullen, who was the animal wrangler on the film, was also the guy responsible for the snakes in Raiders of the Lost Ark. I mean, he's a long-time experienced. And when I first met with him, he said, he had a pad of paper and said, okay, what kind of animals do you have? And I said, well, it's a period piece, so we need horses, but they're just carriage horses. And there's the main character in the Oz section is a chicken. Okay, what does the chicken have to do? Well, the chicken has to talk, but the puppet will take care of that. But the chicken has to fly, it has to attack Mombi, it has to do this and that. And he would, checking his box, said, no problem, no problem. And I said, okay. And then I said, well, there's also a dog, there's Toto. He has a cameo role in the film. He's not in the main part of the film, but he exists in Kansas. What does Toto have to do? Well, he has to chase the chickens and anything else. Well, yeah, he has to howl, and he dropped his pad at that point and said, that's impossible. I said, what do you mean? Well, you told me Toto is a terrier. Yes. Well, terriers don't howl. And I thought, wait a minute, I'm in England, which is the country of dogs. It has to be. Are you kidding me? He said, no, and he got into lecture mode. He said, no, there's a bifurcation thousands of years ago between the wolf and the terrier. If your dog has wolf genes, then they will howl, but terriers have had howling taken out. So, headache numbers 7,500. He has to howl. What are we going to do? Thinking dangle meat above, so, whatever. And in the middle of trying to deal with this, we went to dinner with a childhood friend of Aggie's in London. And we were having dinner and conversation and everything. And then an ambulance went by in the street with a siren. And then the siren faded out and there was now howling from the basement. And I said, what is that? Oh, that's Tansy. She always howls when an ambulance goes by. So I dropped my fork and ran down to the basement, opened the door, and Tansy looked at me. And I looked at her and said, woo. And she went, woo. I said, you're going to be a star. And so Tansy, she became this big exception to Cullen's law about terriers. And she lived, she did her job here absolutely perfectly. And Mike Cullen loved her and used her in a lot of commercials. Subsequently, she had a long and productive life.
So we all love this film, and it's a favorite for a lot of ours, but there was a time where there was some roughness in it, that there was some time where you weren't the director for a minute in making this film, that it was taken away at some point, or you were. There was, yeah. So, what was going on in those moments? Because you're doing an impossible task of puppetry and stunts and bringing Oz to life, and this is suddenly taken away.
Yeah, as wonderful as David Watkins' photography was, the multiple cameras, everything was good. In the week following hiring him, we didn't suddenly speed up hugely, and Richard Berger visited London, and the decision, there had been a crisis with Paul Maslansky, who, when I was shooting the farm stuff on location, Maslansky was redesigning the background of the hall, the set of the heads, and that drove me crazy, because you're the producer of the film, you don't change the set without talking to me. So I was constantly feeling this pressure from somebody who had said, I'm not your friend on this film. And things came to a head, and I was told that I was going to be let go for the good of the film and the good of me. So for your own good and the good of the film, you're being fired. And this is, of course, a huge crisis for somebody who had such deep attachment to the material, who had written the screenplay and was now directing it. And luckily, the Bush Telegraph gossip channels in London spread quickly, and Robert Watts, who was one of the producers of the Indiana Jones films and also worked on Star Wars, found out about it, and he called George Lucas, who was in Japan talking to Kurosawa about a project that they were going to work on together. And George, bless his heart forever, jumped on a plane and flew from Tokyo to London and met with Richard Berger and used a Jedi mind trick and said, you are going to rehire Walter to work on this film. It was not quite as simple as that, but Francis had also flown to London. He had just finished shooting Cotton Club, yes, which was its own problems. And Phil Kaufman came, so I was suddenly surrounded by friends from San Francisco who gathered around this crisis point. We never stopped shooting. Mike Kitchens, who I mentioned was the acting coach, was directing on set, and I was phoning it in, basically, what are you shooting today, or make sure you get this. And so the momentum of the film continued. Basically, I think what George, aside from the Jedi mind trick aspects, he said, you're not going to get anyone to take this film on. You know, it's too particular, and it's got too much a stamp of Walter and the Oz things. And he then said, if you hire Walter and there continues to be a problem, then I will come in and help direct the thing. I did get rehired a week after being fired, and we started again, and it's not an experience I would want anyone to have, that you feel like you've been dipped in molten acid or something. But we got going again, and we managed to ultimately finish the film on time. And George did not have to come back and direct it. And I met with George and I said, here, the problems were, and if, what is your, looking at that, what's your suggestion, what can I do more to help things? And he said, shoot the masters. And I said, yes, but we have all of these puppets who have to be hidden. Puppetry has to be hidden, and it's a 9-year-old girl. And he said, I know, but just shoot it anyway. You will be able to use some parts of it, but the main advantage of doing that first thing in the morning is that that tells everyone on set what you're trying to achieve for the day. Then you can go in and selectively improve what needs to be improved with coverage. But that also means that the heads of departments, when you shoot storyboards only, which is what I have been doing, the heads of departments don't know what to expect for the day. And so that means that they feel they have to be on set, which means they are not preparing for the next set. So this, once you shoot the master, the feeling is, and it's largely illusionary, but still it's important, the feeling is, okay, I know what is going to be achieved today, so now I can delegate this responsibility. This is the heads of departments talking, production design, costume, makeup, hair, and all that kind of stuff. So that was, if there was any one secret, it was that. We started shooting these masters, which in fact, George was right. Some of that was usable, some was not for obvious reasons. But in the end, it did allow us to keep going. The other fantastic thing that happened was that Paul Maslany had a huge hit with Police Academy, which he had produced, and that was his film. And so his interest in Return to Oz diminished very low. And as a result, there was a degree more collaboration with him rather than him feeling that he had to be in control of this.
There's so many coincidences with you and your family, and just the fact that you were in a crisis, you had 3 magical friends come to your aid. It's just unbelievable to me. Can you talk a little bit about Frank L. Baum and who he was and what he...
Yeah, he was born and raised in upstate New York. He, as a young kid, got fascinated in theater, and he married into the Gage family, which was a very women's lib. This is in the 1850s, 1860s. And he and his wife moved to North Dakota, and he started a newspaper there. He was the editor of the newspaper, and he was greatly influenced by women's liberation. And if you read the Oz books, you can kind of tell that the role of women in those books, Dorothy obviously, but Ozma and the other women characters are very powerful, and the men, like the wizard, are kind of his semi-functioning. And he was a theosophist, which was a form of multiple religion. They were interested in religiosity broadly and respected all religions for what religions can bring. And the newspaper folded. He tried to start a hardware store and wound up moving to Chicago, where he earned a living designing windows for department stores. And he wrote books on how to do this, and so there was stuff going on. And he, I think, had 3 sons by this time, and his father-in-law had died in the 1880s, and then his mother-in-law, who was this powerful suffragette figure, moved in with them, and then she died in 1898, something like that. And his young niece died of meningitis or something at age 8 months. And so there was this crisis in the family of these deaths. And he started spinning a story based on the Chicago World's Fair, which had they had all seen in the 1890s. And that was known not as the Emerald City, but as the White City. But people walked around with green sunglasses to kill the whiteness of it. And the kids would say, look, it's all green. And so he began to spun this story, combining the experiences of living in North Dakota on the plains, and then this magical city of the Chicago World's Fair transformed into this fairyland. And the three characters who lived on the farm were Dorothy, which was the name of the niece who had died, M, which was the nickname of his mother-in-law, and Henry, which was literally the name of his father-in-law. So he conjured these stories up in a way of helping his sons overcome the trauma of all of these deaths in the family, that they are alive in this fairyland world.
And the word Oz, you did some research as to where you think Oz came from.
Well, there's several stories about that. His own explanation for it, when he asked, he would defer, and finally people kept saying, no, where did it come from? And he said, no, I was just thinking, and I looked at my filing cabinet, and the bottom drawer was O-Z, and I thought Oz. But there is another land in subsequent books called Ev, and Oz and Ev are words in the Turkish language for home and hearth and heart and soul. And given his theosophy background, this multiple religion thing, it's not impossible that he somehow got these words out of that culture. So, I mean, it's interesting that, you know, the Wizard of Oz is almost by definition American mythology. We refer to lines from that book in the film all the time, and you know, we're not in Kansas anymore, and, all of that kind of stuff. And yet, Baum himself was anti-militaristic. There's lots of jokes about the army in his books, and very much pro-women's suffrage, and also this idea of multiple religions, that there isn't one religion, there is another kind of metaphysical thing going on there.
And you'd mentioned you wanted this to be you wish this was the audience from what it first.
Right.
Was there anything that you watched tonight that you noticed, or that you gained from watching it tonight, or anything that you picked up?
Yeah, well, I mean, the fact that the audience was vocal and laughed at Belina and situations was fantastic. And, you know, just looking again at Ruse's performance is always, you know, I see new things that, you know, I've seen the film obviously hundreds, thousands of times in the editing and in screenings, but just looking at it again, I just saw more and more about it, and just, you know, thinking how complicated it was to pull all of this stuff off. You know, there's a great line from Sidney Pollack that when we were previewing Talented Mr. Ripley, which is, there are tough things about that film in a good way, but some of the previews were not good at all. And Sidney consoled Anthony, and he said, you know, when you are taking an audience to hell and back, the bus has to say to hell and back on the front so that they know where they're going. And, you know, I think when this film was released, the ad campaign did not help what this film was about. You have to remember also that not only did the development staff disappear and Richard Berger took over, but then a year later Richard Berger was gone, and there was a whole new regime, the Eisner regime at Disney. So our film was two executive generations old, and you know, There is less investment by an executive power at that point. And there was an ad campaign which I think could have been okay, but at the very last minute I got a call from Disney saying, we changed the ad campaign, what we had wasn't working, and we think the new campaign is going to really work, you'll love it. And I was in the middle of finishing the film, the mix at that time, and I thought, okay. But it was definitely not, it was an ad campaign that looked in the cold light of day, said, we have no confidence in this film. But there was a fantastic poster from
Drew Struzan.
Drew Struzan, yeah. Early on that I loved, which was a kind of an Art Nouveau poster of a Mombi-like face with Art Nouveau with the heads of girls in it. It was kind of spectral and witchy, and it said, this is a sequel to The Wizard of Oz in a sense, but it's not, it's not Munchkin singing. And somehow they killed that approach very early on, Disney did. But had they gone with it in retrospect, I think the film, who knows what would have happened, but it would have been better, I think.
I think the adults made it a little difficult on you, and maybe some of the adults who rejected it, but the adults from the land of children loved it. And when I watched it when I was a kid, it was incredible.
Yeah.
And so, we love it. We are so glad you came down to share this. We're so glad that you made this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Walter Murch, everybody.